Welcome to MarketPlay, the marketing podcast where we chat with small business owners and entrepreneurs all about what they do and how they got to where they are. I'm your host, Meryl Hathaway, and we're brought to you by Two Trees PPC out of Sacramento, California. So sit back and listen to our conversation as we chat all about business, and welcome to MarketPlay. Hello, I'm Meryl Hathaway. Happy Earth Day and 420 week. Very important things going on. Today, our guest is Jonathan Havens, who is the co-chair of both the Cannabis Law Practice and the Food, Beverage, and Agribusiness Practice at Saul Ewing Arnstein & Lear, LLP. He counsels state cannabis license applicants and awardees, ancillary service and product providers, investors, management companies, and various other entities that are all affected by federal and state cannabis laws. In addition to his cannabis law practice, Jonathan maintains an active food and beverage practice, particularly with regard to CBD products, in which he counsels manufacturers, importers, distributors, and retailers of conventional food, dietary supplements, and beverages on product development, claim substantiation, labeling, promotion, registration, reporting, and recall issues to ensure compliance with U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and state and local requirements. He does a lot, guys, but there's more. Since 2019, Jonathan has been listed in Chambers USA, America's leading lawyers for business, for his nationwide cannabis law practice. In 2018, he was named to the National Law Journal's inaugural Cannabis Law Trailblazers list. He is regularly interviewed by mainstream and trade press outlets alike, so this is old hat for him, and has been quoted by or authored pieces for CNBC, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Wired, MarketWatch, Engadget, Law 360, High Times Magazine, Cannabis Business Times, Hemp Industry Daily, Marijuana Business Daily, and Hemp Magazine. Jonathan currently serves on Law 360's Cannabis Editorial Advisory Board and the Food and Drug Law Institute's Cannabis-Derived Products Committee. Before he entered private practice, Jonathan served as a regulatory counsel with FDA, where he focused on compliance and enforcement related to promotion, advertising, and labeling. Prior to law school, he served as a legislative aide in both the U.S. Senate and U.S. House of Representatives. Could we have a cooler guest on the show? I'd love to welcome Jonathan to the show. Hello, sir. Good
A couple of
morning.
things. I want, instead of just giving people my bio, I'm just going to send them the recording because you made me sound way cooler than I am. That's the first thing. The second thing is I realized I definitely need a tan. I'm very pale. So with that, I think we can proceed with the podcast.
To be fair, you're based in Maryland and I am in sunny California. So this is just part of the game here. And I'm pale to most people. So I'm so excited to have you, especially on 420 week. We're celebrating. So we're going to jump right into the first segment of the show called Getting to Know You. And I'm going to ask you a series of this or that questions. You just give me your first instinct response. Ready, let's play. Okay. Tablet or laptop?
Laptop.
Yeah. Do you have a tablet?
I don't. I mean, there are iPads all over my house, but I have a small laptop. Let's put it that way. So like when they say on the airplane, if you have a laptop less than 5 pounds, you can keep your laptop out. That's me. Or at least I say it.
You've got one of those. Impressive. All right. Smoke or vape? I know.
Like smoking for the old school feel and the nostalgia, but vape for the convenience and the discreetness.
Okay. I appreciate that. Well, I'm sure we'll get back to that at some point. Instagram or TikTok?
Instagram.
Okay. iPhone or
iPhone.
Android?
You know what? I'm going to tell you a little story. I had an Android.
Please.
I had an Android. Jane and I both had it. My wife Jane and I both had Androids, and we went out to dinner, and we were like taking pictures and checking in and like really taking the phones for a spin. And we went to write, like out with our droids, and it autocorrected to Druid. And I said, if the damn phone has to autocorrect its name incorrectly, then it's not worth my time. And that was the end. That's the end of it.
I think that's totally fair, and I love that that's your response because it's not what I expected, but it's really, again, it's fair. Also, autocorrect is way off base far too often. I feel like we need to be submitting something to all the different companies to be like,
where do you get duck from over and over again when you know what word I need to use? I don't understand.
No, I 100% agree, but people will get a sense of me by understanding that autocorrect and the phone and the name, like that's how I make decisions.
I love it. Okay. 420 or 710?
420.
Yeah. I mean, it's the classic. 710, if people don't know it, is for dabbing. It's a different part of using cannabis, different way of using cannabis. And it's also become sort of a recognized holiday. But it's nowhere near 420. 420 represents a lot of cool stuff, including my neighbor's birthday, as it turns out.
That's why I celebrate it.
I know. All right. And lastly, Netflix or YouTube?
I have to admit, I didn't really understand YouTube for a long time, but we no longer have cable. We have, what do I use? Roku. And YouTube TV is my TV provider, if you will. So I like YouTube, but Netflix is pretty awesome. So I didn't give you an answer, and I'm not going to give you one.
All right. Fine. I'll have to just stick with that. Okay, so I am so excited to hear this. So Humble Beginnings is our next segment, where basically I just want to know what your very, very first job ever was.
Very first job. I know what my first job was. I answered phones at my synagogue on Sunday mornings from 9 to 1.
Yeah.
During high school, I did my homework. That was my job.
Wow. What kind of calls would you get at the synagogue?
So I remember being very flustered by the calls that I got, not because they were stressful, but because I'm a flustered person. People would call about probably donations that they wanted to make. The thing that stressed me out is that I remember, this is a really long time ago, but something about, there were funerals on Sundays, because in Judaism, right, Saturday's a Sabbath. You don't have a funeral on a Saturday. I hope I'm not doing disservice to my rabbi here, but I think people would call about funeral things, and there was just sensitive things that if you got it wrong, right, if you gave people the wrong directions to the cemetery, that would be bad. So I just was flustered.
It's like high stakes Judaism. Was
Yeah,
your job.
I mean, so I was flustered. I had lots of other amazing jobs in and around that time, but that was my first one that I can remember.
Okay, tell me another one. Tell me one of the ones that really stands out as another cool way you started making.
So I was a sales associate at the Gap.
I knew that about you.
I say sales associate because never learned how to use the cash register. I wasn't good at folding clothes, so I think I pretty much was like a greeter. They had me work the fitting rooms once, and there was training about loss prevention, and at the end of my shift, there were about 45 theft sensors on the ground, so someone had clearly stolen a lot of clothing. I wasn't very good at that either. Around that same time, I was a waiter at, as you know, the Broadway Diner in Rockville, where I ate my weight in cheese, grilled cheeses, cannolis, and Diet Coke. The Diet Coke was important because of the cannolis and the grilled cheese. I've had other interesting jobs. I worked at the bookstore in college.
I always thought that seemed like a really cool job because I feel like you're trying to meet people all the time in college. Like that's one of the fun things about college is you're constantly like, oh, maybe I belong here. Maybe I belong here. That guy seems cool. And you follow those different threads. And I always felt like the people who worked at the bookshop got to kind of meet everybody at one point.
So a couple things. Working at a cool bookshop with like a coffee shop is cool and hipster and like, this was the university bookstore, the big one with all the clothing. And they had cool stuff there, but I would see people from my classes, and I'd try to be like, yeah, I'm that guy from your class, and they're like, you work at the bookstore? And I'm like, yeah, I work at the bookstore, and that would be it. There'd be nothing else to talk about, and they were like, I don't want to be interacting with you here. I was like, okay, cool.
Oh, so it was sort of a disadvantage. Okay, I get it. But it sounds like there were a lot of jobs that were customer service and just service-related jobs with dealing with people all the time.
Totally.
And
totally.
having to field calls and different customers, and that's a lot of what I think everybody should have to learn at some point or have to do in their life with work, because I just think it gives you a good basis of like how to handle any other situation, but also then you're just more mindful all the time, don't you think, about when you're interacting with people in all kinds of situations?
Yeah, I mean, I always say that everybody should be a waiter or a waitress or, work in customer service in retail. Granted, my career in retail and in the restaurant industry was very short-lived because I was terrible at everything. But I did learn a lot. I certainly, even if my service is bad, I'm not one to not give a generous tip. Another job that I had that I learned a lot was I interned on Capitol Hill, starting at a young age, like a weirdly young age, not in a creepy way, but I talked to constituents, like people that would call in and need something from their representative or from a committee. And a lot of these folks were characters, but everyone was entitled to something or deserved good customer service, and you had to treat everybody the same. And even if the questions they were asking were difficult, they were important. I mean, we worked for them. So I'm really happy that I had that experience at a young age, because it taught me a lot about people's motivations and their concerns and what drives people. So from that perspective, it was great.
Yeah, that sounds like such incredible experience and such valuable experience. And I've talked to those people many times when I call about an issue that I want my representative to vote yes or no on. And it is interesting because I always kind of wonder who really is behind my call. And I try to be mindful also that they're dealing with those types of calls all day, which sounds really overwhelming also, because I can imagine a lot of people call and they're very heated about things. Is that, did you get calls like that?
My first job in the Senate after I graduated from college was with the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee. And one thing I learned is how horribly our country treats our veterans, which is disgusting on a number of fronts, right? We send these people into harm's way to protect our freedoms, and then we can't get them their medical benefits when they come home. I mean, I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it happens way more than it should. So listening to Vietnam vets who called up and said, I should be getting these medications covered, or there's a 10-month waiting list at the VA for this procedure to see this doctor. It was really difficult, and it was like a collision, right? I'm this 22-year-old, I just graduated from college, had all this fun, and then I'm out in the real world hearing about people with real problems, and I really didn't know what to do about it other than roll up my sleeves and do what I could. I'm sure I didn't do enough, but it's kind of one of those things that I was like, okay, this is the kind of job that someone should have, right? To listen to our veterans, to try to help them out. And we couldn't help everybody, but I'd like to think that we helped as many people as we could.
Yeah. Wow. That's got to be so... thank you for your service.
I didn't serve. I helped people who serve, let's be clear. But I'm glad I had the opportunity to do that.
A facilitator is a really important role. I just have to say that. A facilitator in many ways is oftentimes without them, things won't actually get done, and people don't find out what the issues are. You might not have gone and made legislation about it, but you certainly were able to give people that information, which is a really important thing. So speaking of which, how did you end up deciding that the law way of doing things was where you were going to go? Because ending up in the cannabis space is, I think, fascinating to most people, but from the angle that you come at, to me, is beyond fascinating, because it's something that it never even really occurred to me, the level of importance of having law within what's going on in that type of industry. So I'd love to know, like, where law school came into play for you, and how, and take your time with it, but how you ended up in the cannabis space.
Sure. So I wish I could say this was a grand plan, that I went to law school and I wanted to be a cannabis lawyer. So a couple things. One, I went to law school for the completely wrong reasons. I went because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. My dad was a lawyer, not a practicing lawyer for much of his career. He was doing things in and around the law, mostly related to kind of law and policy like I do now, regulations, those sorts of things. But I had that, I saw him being a lawyer. I knew he went to law school. I knew what that entailed. I probably, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say this, I grew up watching a lot of movies, a lot of TV, a lot of, legal dramas, legal things like that. I saw lawyers as people wearing expensive suits and making arguments, and sometimes they were good, sometimes they were bad, but it seemed like a lot of fun. So I
have to stop you and just say how common I think this is. I think this is how a lot of people look at it. And I think also it's how a lot of people end up going to law school. I really do. I think it's a path that just is like, well, I guess that makes sense, and a lot of people do it. So if that gets me the suit and the job in the house, then okay. So like, I just have to comment, I think it's very common, and I just love that you shared it in that way. I think it's great.
Very common. And, you know, it's funny. When I was in law school, one of the things that we learned from the economic crises that we've seen in our lifetime, you know, 2008 and, you know, recession and COVID and all these things, we're seeing that people being motivated by money and going into career paths that they think are going to pay a certain amount of money is usually, that's a recipe for disaster. So one of the things that's happened over the past several years is that law schools have actually been sued for publicizing average salaries of their graduates. Because what was happening that you heard is that law schools were saying, here is the average salary that our graduates make when they leave. And it's premised on those that go to the biggest law firms and make the most money and so on and so forth. So, you know, I think a lot of people went to law school thinking, okay, well, I'm going to come out of law school and I'm going to make $160,000 a year, and I'm going to be able to do this and I'm going to be able to do that. So I graduated law school in 2010 when we were still in the throes of the 2008 real estate crash, the mortgage-backed securities issues, and there were no jobs. I mean, I had connections from my time on Capitol Hill. I had connections from growing up in the DC suburbs. My parents know a lot of people, and I kind of thought, if I graduate, if I get a diploma, I will get a job. And
I'm good. That's my
totally,
ticket. Like, makes sense.
I couldn't find a job to save my life. And what ended up happening is I saw through a posting with our career services office, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is hiring the title is regulatory counsels in their new Center for Tobacco Products. And I'm like, whoa, that's a lot. Like, what does that mean? What are these people going to do? One of the things I learned in the interviewing process, or preparing for my interview, is that FDA had just started regulating tobacco federally in 2009, which was a surprise to me, is a surprise to some people when I tell them that. People think that tobacco's been regulated for a very long time and hasn't. And I kind of was like, okay, I can't find a job at a law firm, and I don't really know that much about the FDA or tobacco, but I see that this new area of the law is being created, and that seems like a really unique opportunity to get in on the ground floor and know as much as anybody else out there. So I went to law school for a specific reason. I wanted to be a telecommunications lawyer, like for cell phone companies. I'd done some of that before, after I left Capitol Hill before law school. That's a side story. Couldn't find a job in the telecom space. So in any event, I was like, okay, FDA is hiring. I'm going to go learn that new area of the law. I'm going to be super marketable. I didn't really have a plan for how that was going to happen. It was, thinking back, like kind of a half-baked plan, but I went to the FDA. I went to the FDA. I learned how they regulate a new product area in tobacco, which has actually been very helpful in thinking about how FDA looks at cannabis, which we can talk about in a few minutes. And then after that, I went into private practice doing FDA work. And it's interesting. I like to pat myself on the back a little bit to have that, okay, I'm not going to look at this job as like, okay, well, that's not for me, and there's nothing I can get from it. It was like, okay, I don't want to be a tobacco lawyer, but how rare of an opportunity is it that you're getting to shape the policy and the regulations in a completely new product area, and then have that help you in your, in your practice, your law practice. So fast forward a couple years, like I said, I went into private practice. I was an FDA lawyer working on foods, drugs, medical devices, whatever FDA regulates. I know what it is, but for your audience, I don't want to bore them with all the different products. But in 2015, I was with an FDA practice of a law firm, and someone said, can you help our client from Colorado? They're setting up shop in Maryland, and they want to grow, process, and dispense cannabis. Like, can you get them a license? And I said to the partner, something you should never say to a partner when you're a junior associate at a firm. I said, I have no idea what that looks like or how to do that. But the next thing I said was very important. I said, The guy was very nice. We were close. He was, kind of a mentor figure. I said, but I'll figure it out. And sure, and again, it was like the tobacco thing. No one knew. That was in 2015. Maryland's program was just really getting off the ground. And this happenstance thing just popped up. I learned everything there was to know about cannabis regulation, not only in Maryland, but in other states. It was super fascinating to me. I kind of laughed. I was like, when I was growing up, and I'm not going to say smoking cannabis, but I'll just say around cannabis, other people, bad influences.
Associating with folks who dabble with...
My associates. And I kind of never figured that there would be a legal application, but it was interesting. All my training as a food and drug attorney and figuring out this interplay between the federal law and the state laws, when the feds think their position is it's federally illegal, but a lot of states say it's legal in their eyes. It was just kind of like the culmination of everything I had done. It was my time on Capitol Hill. It was my time at FDA. And then also around the same time, and this is the last thing I'll say and then I'll shut up, I was in New York City visiting my best friend. And his son was, I can't remember how old he was at the time. I witnessed his son have one of his very first, it's called an infantile spasm. It's a form of childhood seizures. And I started doing research, and no one knew what was going on. I kind of consider this kid to be my nephew. No one knew what was going on with him. They later found out. But it, through the meetings with doctors and clinical trials and experimental medicines, one of the things that was talked about was cannabis and the medical application. I always thought cannabis was something that people smoke to get high and have fun, which is great. But for me as an FDA lawyer, I'm like, okay, well, what about the medical application? Where does that fit in to me having a practice as a lawyer? So I started looking at the clinical trials. I started looking at what FDA was doing. And again, that was it snowballed from there. But it was a very accidental drop into the cannabis space. It was not planned at all.
And very organic,
Totally.
though. It really sounds like everything that you had been building upon from that. I need a job. I haven't found a job the way that I want to. Okay, there's something that's available. I don't know anything about it, but I can try. And then going for it, and then getting to know that well, and getting in a flow of that enough that other things came up because of it, including this moment, and then a personal connection, too. I mean, how much more organic could that possibly have been, which is, I think, so fascinating. So one of the things I'd love to ask is just, what do you think that one of the main things that the public in general doesn't really understand about cannabis or doesn't know about cannabis, that people like you, having done so much research on so many different sides of it and having experience in the way that you do, would be able to tell us?
Yeah, so one of the things, people know that cannabis is federally illegal, but specifically,
Right.
It's Schedule 1. There's Schedules 1 through 5 under the Controlled Substances Act. It's called marijuana under the Controlled Substances Act, which is actually, I found out through my practice, a pejorative term. It's got pretty nasty roots, so I generally will use the term cannabis rather than marijuana, but it gets confusing because you have federally illegal marijuana, and then you have federally legal hemp. Both marijuana and hemp are Cannabis sativa L. It's from the same plant species. One is federally illegal, one's federally legal. The answer to your question, though, is one of the things I don't think the public understands is because marijuana is Schedule 1, it makes it damn near impossible to do anything with it, from researching it to consuming it to transporting it. And all these states, there are 37 states that have some form of a medical cannabis program, but it's not, with minor exceptions, there's no reciprocity, right? So if you have a medical card in California and you come to Maryland, it's not like you can walk into a Maryland dispensary and get cannabis products. And also, you can't fly with medical cannabis. Some airports are more lax about that, but it's all TSA. It's all federally regulated. So if they're looking in your bags, which they're not really for cannabis because of how it's treated in the states, but the bottom line is, even if it's legal from one state to another, and it's really authorized in one state or authorized in another state, no state can really legalize, it's still illegal to transport it across state borders. It's still, you can still be fired for failing a drug test. in many states because the law is such that, well, it's federally illegal, so we can fire you for failing a drug test. There are just so many things that are affected by this Schedule I status. The biggest thing that I think is really unfortunate is how much research is hampered. We are only starting to scratch the surface when it comes to the medical utility of not only CBD, cannabidiol, and THC. It's really, I would say, THC first, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. A lot of people talk about these major cannabinoids, CBD and THC, because those are the ones that people know. There are over 100 phytocannabinoids in the cannabis plant, and there are so many potential medical applications, but because of this Schedule I status, it's made it very, very difficult to study it. And so what I'm seeing, and I'm hopeful about, is many people support opening up the research pathways, even if they don't support legalization. And that makes sense, right? You want to develop these breakthrough products for unmet medical needs. And so I think that people don't realize that it's even hard to research this, let alone get it approved, get it out in the hands of the public.
It's mind-blowing, right? And it's one of those things where, as someone who has dealt with chronic pain for years at a time, I use it in a medical application. It helped me with my pain management. It helped me to make sure that I wasn't requiring the pharmaceutical pain medication as much, which is obviously a huge crisis, the opioid crisis going on, and has been going on. And it seems like one of those things where when you really look at the landscape of it, it just feels like there's so many benefits to cannabis, and like you're saying, so many different directions we don't even know about that it might be helping, that it just feels so unfair and just confusing as to why it's still not allowed. One thing that I thought was fascinating was a handful of years ago, I was looking into doing new volunteer opportunities, and I wanted to volunteer at Children's Hospital here in LA. And I was not allowed to read to children after having 3 interviews, including like a full-on interview with the director, who left me going, I'm so excited for you to come on board. And then I didn't pass the drug screening because I use legal medical cannabis. And wanted to donate my time to reading to children, and they wouldn't allow me to do it because it's federally regulated or it's federally funded. And I was baffled, and I was so furious. And I sent him an email that was just long and winding of like, to be penalized for something that is a natural plant, but beyond that is legal where we live, legal where the entity is, all those things. And it was so confusing to me. So one of the things I'm really curious about is, how do you feel like you're able to either see a path in one way or set your clients up really for long-term success when there are these, like, there's so much rapidly changing, it's just a rapidly changing legal landscape, and it sounds like there's so many pitfalls that keep happening because of the federal side of it. And I'm just curious how you guide people or see a path despite all of that.
Yeah, great question. So I just want to mention one thing. You talked about opioids, and it's funny. When I talk a lot at conferences in this space, and I talk to clients, and people ask me my views about policies and why are all these states adopting these programs. I always like to say that every state, most states, have 2 things in common. 1, they're broke, and 2, they have an opioid epidemic. And cannabis has been viewed as kind of a savior to both issues. The opioid epidemic thing is a little bit more controversial, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the broke thing, I mean, these states are making a ton of money from tax revenue from these businesses. Illinois just reported for the very first time ever, Q1 of this year, they made more from revenue from cannabis sales than they did from alcohol sales. So that gives you a sense of what, purchase. I know, it's pretty amazing. And think about it. I mean, Chicago, big alcohol city, big alcohol distribution point.
Yeah, like huge. That is like the crux of what they do.
And look, people are still kind of using both substances, alcohol and cannabis, but patterns are shifting. But the opioid issue, it's a little bit more controversial because some people say, well, it's a controlled substance and you're replacing one drug for another drug. Well, I'm not going to get into the science and what my beliefs are, although I think it's probably pretty well documented that cannabis is not as addictive or addictive at all as compared to the opioid addiction. I will just say this, opinions aside, several states, Illinois included, Pennsylvania, some others, have essentially said, if you have an opioid prescription, we will give you a medical cannabis card and swap those out. Meaning, if you are, addicted to opioids or potentially going to be addicted to opioids, we would rather you be on medical cannabis, be using medical cannabis. So I'm not even going to, insert myself into this conversation. All I'll say is that there are a number of states that have said, we're so desperate for a solution to the opioid epidemic, we would rather our citizens have medical cannabis cards. So, make of that what you will.
Wow. That's incredible.
But as far as the kind of
wow.
what's my angle in the laws and how do you operate within a federally illegal business, it's really tough.
Yeah.
So there's two sides of this that I want to make sure we hit. One is the business side, the operators, the growers, the processors, the dispensaries. The other is the patient side or consumer side if you're in an adult use or rec state, employees, those sorts of things. So let me talk about the business side first, because many of those, those are my clients. And when I say businesses, I don't just mean growers, processors, dispensaries. I mean, ancillary service and product providers, those that are supplying services, products to the cannabis industry. I'm talking about those that are affected by cannabis laws, colleges and universities who have employees who have medical cards, or students that have medical cards. You mentioned your experience volunteering at Children's Hospital in LA. A lot of these, a lot of employers get federal funding, or they themselves are federal agencies, or they're colleges and universities that rely on federal funding. And there are certain policies that you have to have in order to maintain that federal funding. And so it can have pretty negative consequences. Question, are you allowed to have a student in a dorm of a university that receives federal funding, use medical cannabis in the dorm? I mean, the Department of Education would on record tell you no, because you cannot allow federally illegal drug use, even though the person has a medical cannabis card. So that's just kind of one example. We talk to colleges and universities about their drug policies and their employees and drug testing and students and, what enforcement you can take. But as far as the businesses, the operators are concerned, it's really complying with state law, because those licenses under those states are really, that's the bread and butter of these businesses. It's how do you have centralized business operations when you can't cross state lines with plant products? Yeah. It's the banking issues, what banks will accept you as a customer. It's how do you,
because banks just shut their accounts down all the time
they still do. Right? There are more banks than there used to be in the space. But in Maryland, for example, there's one bank that will provide services to what are called plant-touching businesses. And so whatever their rates are, whatever their compliance obligations are, you either choose that or you keep the cash in a vault on your site, which is not safe. And Congress is looking at this. There's this Safe Banking Act that's passed the House a few times. The Senate, I just read this morning, is not going to be taking it up anytime soon.
Of course.
It's actually...
Thanks, Senate, for all that you don't do.
Some would say it's a good reason, because the chair of the banking committee, Senator Sherrod Brown from Ohio, is saying he's not going to push the bill without social justice reform attached to it, with the understanding that why should we benefit wealthy, potentially white-owned businesses from a banking perspective without addressing the fact that there are a lot of people incarcerated for the same things that a lot of these businesses are legally doing. So it's not all bad, but it would be helpful if we could get some incremental reform. But the things that I'm talking about are the things that we help our clients sort out. How do you raise money in a federally illegal space? How do you maintain licensure? How do you, go public in Canada but have U.S. shareholders? I mean, it's like these complicated cross-border, cross-state questions, compliance, tax issues, intellectual property issues, drug testing issues, litigation, regulatory. I mean, the cannabis practice is like a microcosm of just the practice of law. All the different areas I just mentioned, there are specialty lawyers within all those areas. So, it's all of that, but it's on steroids because it's federally illegal. And with all of that in mind, you have to figure, okay, how does my approach to a normal contract change now that parties are contracting for an underlying, federally illegal business?
Yeah. Wow. There's so much within that, everything you just said. Thank you for giving all that information. It's, and on the one hand, like, so upsetting, in that it also led me to another question about the incarcerated people for marijuana, where when you think about it, is just so bonkers crazy at this point. And I actually do have a lot of respect for Senator Brown. He was on a panel with the YWCA all about racial justice, and he is doing so much and has dedicated his career to racial justice. So hearing that he's the one who wanted to add that in there does actually make a lot more sense to me when I hear it that way. It's unfortunate that it wouldn't move forward because of it, but I just want to say that because he's an individual I now have found some newfound respect for. But it really, it is so insane that they have to work within cash and also to know how much tax revenue is now being created, and yet only one bank will handle any of it or be the mitigator between. That just seems like the worst business model on the planet.
It makes no sense. No credit cards. It's a lot of cash. Some of these states have closed loop debit systems, but yeah, I mean, on the tax issue, I hear people say all the time, well, these cannabis businesses don't pay taxes, so what does it matter? Not only do cannabis businesses pay taxes, their marginal tax rate is far higher than any other standard business because
it's really high.
There's a law that says you can't take ordinary business deductions related to federally illegal activity. It's kind of like the old, we talk about in law school, the mob bosses can't can't write off their mileage for driving around to do their shakedowns, right? You can't take tax deductions for illegal activity. Law school's not all boring. There's some funny things to it, but don't get me wrong, it's mostly boring. But and so the marginal tax rates for these businesses are insane, and because it's federally illegal, you can't take these deductions. And so the banking is hard, the tax deductions are hard, the drug testing issues are hard, the federal-state conflict is hard. I mean, it's wild, but yeah, I mean, I don't want to get lost in the conversation. The big part of, consumers and patients and just individuals, which is we have a lot of people who are incarcerated for buying and selling cannabis. And obviously that's a lot of people are doing that legally. Now, when the people that were incarcerated did it, it was not treated the same. But a lot of the conversation now is talking about automatic expungement of marijuana-related offenses under a certain amount, or people are talking about that. And some states have even taken to having specific point values when you're trying to get a license to grow, process, or dispense cannabis. If someone who is involved in your business, in your kind of your equity of your business, was incarcerated or has a family member that was incarcerated, basically to widen the tent to have it include people who have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs. African American communities, Latin American, Latino American communities. I mean, obviously we know the war on drugs has failed, and it has failed at the hands, and on the backs of minorities. It hasn't been whites that have been disproportionately affected. So state regulators are talking about this, federal regulators are talking about it, but we're not where we need to be yet. That is for sure.
Yeah, and on that point, I do think that because if you look at a lot of this on paper, it again, there's a lot of upsetting stuff, a lot of things that don't make any sense, that if you're a reasonable person, I think in a lot of different senses, you would look at that and go, come on, about so much of this. But at the same time, there is so much dialogue happening. I mean, it's really incredible to pull up or Google something, and there's so much being discussed on multiple different types of platforms. I mean, talk about the discussions like within government, within the law, looking at things so differently than it was even 10 years ago. Don't you think, as a bright spot, that there really has been so much momentum moving forward to change all of this? And within that, I feel like, one thing that I've also seen is just that, like you said earlier in the show, that even if people don't necessarily want full-on legalization, they can understand where there are so many benefits within cannabis. And that is a really big change.
100%. Just kind of two factors to back up what you were just talking about. So number one is, a lot of people say, well, cannabis is just a liberal coastal state issue, and these red states, politically red states, aren't involved in the cannabis space. So first of all, that's completely wrong. I mean, look at the 2020 elections. There are states that overwhelmingly supported former President Trump, voted to reelect him, and also passed cannabis-related ballot initiatives, right? Mississippi, North Dakota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana. So don't let someone tell you that marijuana is only a liberal coastal issue. It cuts across.
And
ages, genders, traditional political lines. I think if politicians realized and smartened up, they would realize they'd support cannabis because it wins very, very big at the ballot box. But, first of all, I think it's just important to understand that even the kind of deep red states, Mississippi passed a medical ballot initiative, and I met with the Mississippi medical ballot initiative folks a couple of years ago when they were first kind of gearing up. And basically what they did is they went to communities where they knew, or friends where they had very sick children who had unmet medical needs, and they were talking about cannabis and relief. And you just need to appeal to people's senses to say, look, you might not want this, but heaven forbid your child or your relative or your niece or your nephew or your grandparent needed something. Why not research it? We're not talking about getting people high. We're talking about stopping intractable epilepsy, right? And when you talk about it from that perspective, it's like, oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Because again, it's a perfect example of we do have way more in common with each other than anyone ever recognizes. And we only talk about, Trump, Biden, red, blue, all of, hate and acceptance as being all these different sides of things. But when it comes down to it, we all care about the people in our lives. We all want to make sure that we're doing as well as we possibly can. And ideally, we all want to help serve our community in one way or another, whichever community you are a part of. So to hear that cannabis is across the board getting approved, it makes so much sense. And I just want to highlight that because it's a really incredible way of looking at it, as like this is one thing that we almost all agree upon, which is incredible.
Yeah, I saw a stat yesterday that 92% of Americans support medical cannabis in some form or fashion. Maybe not legalization, but maybe research, maybe legalization, but whatever it is, I totally agree with you, and it can be hard to find things that we all or many of us agree on. So that is not to be lost. But to your question about hasn't the discussion evolved, on January 4th of 2018, at that time, the Attorney General was Jeff Sessions. And Jeff Sessions woke up that day and said, you know what? I don't like this memo that was issued in the Obama administration dealing with the cannabis industry. I'm going to rescind this memo. It's called the Cole Memo, named after former Deputy Attorney General James Cole in the Obama White House. And it basically said to states, look, we know many of you are passing these laws. It's still federally illegal, but as long as you comply with these enforcement priorities, you won't hear from the feds. I'm shortchanging it, but that's essentially what it said. Jeff Sessions said, you know what? That has not been passed by Congress. It's just unenforceable guidance. I'm going to withdraw it. I'm going to rescind it. Everyone thought the sky was falling. I got many scared phone calls from clients. Cannabis stocks were fluctuating. But in a very perverse way, what Jeff Sessions forced was for people to put their money where their mouth is when it came to supporting cannabis reform initiatives, because we realized we can't take for granted these, memos, these unenforceable guidance documents that aren't permanent. And it really motivated, you finally saw pieces of legislation coming up in votes, at state houses across the United States and also in the U.S. Congress. You saw politicians coming out and speaking about it. It wasn't a complete sea change. But in a perverse way, I'm thankful that Jeff Sessions rescinded the Cole Memo because it spurred so many positive discussions and so many reform efforts. Even if they weren't all successful, there was like 100% more action after he rescinded the Cole Memo. So at the time, I wasn't thrilled about it, of course, and I wouldn't say thank you to him to his face for doing that, but it made people say, okay, am I going to fight for this, or am I just going to rely on others to do the fighting for me? So it's interesting when these little or big things happen, what it causes. And, I'm kind of hopeful that with more elections, when we see that, and these are the headlines, weed wins big at the ballot box. It always has whenever these measures have been up, and I think it will continue to do that. And so I'm hopeful that there will continue to be reform.
Oh, I hope so too. And that did give me a lot of hope. And I will not say thank you to him, but I will say thank you to everyone who has continued to lobby around this for years and decades and career spans, because there are a lot of people who get zero credit within the cannabis field who have been at it forever because they believe in it to help people. And I just want to say that because I think again, like you said, thinking about it in terms of like, oh, it's just for fun and we get high. That is one side of it. And also great, beneficial, awesome. At the same token, there are so many people with anxiety and depression and epilepsy and chronic pain and so many other things that this actually genuinely is, as prescribed, works to help them in ways that other things can't. So that being said, Jonathan, this has been like incredible. I have a couple random questions that I like to throw in at the end, toward the end of the show, under the branded category, so I can add some numbers. You kind of already went over some of these, so maybe they're redundant, but we'll see. All right, first question. Cannabis was one industry that did very well in 2020. So roughly how much did it actually grow by in the U.S.? Was it A, roughly 1 billion it grew by, roughly 18 billion, or C, roughly 45 billion?
I'm going to have to say 18 billion.
Correct. It's projected to grow to 24 billion this year. Wow. Billion is a lot. 18 billion is a whole lot.
The way I kind of processed the numbers was I was thinking about, I was on a call yesterday with the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission, and they were talking about the numbers and sales and, patients and things. And each, in the program, Maryland, I think, has done $1 billion in sales now. That's been over a few years. But Illinois, I just talked, these states are bringing in serious revenue from it. So
they're raking it in. Yeah. And cannabis, because of that, is more expensive for the consumer in a lot of ways because now there's taxes added, which is a very big difference.
Definitely on
the
the adult use side. Medical taxation works a little bit differently. Some of the states have said this is because there's not insurance to reimburse people. We shouldn't overtax the medical. But on the rec side, it's going to be taxed pretty heavily. And you know what? You should know that these businesses put their neck on the line, and it's expensive to be these businesses. So you should be okay paying those taxes.
Right.
That's how I feel, at least.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of looking at it too. Absolutely. So next question, will cannabis prices increase or decline in 2021?
I think they will decline as there are further efficiencies in these, it's economies of scale for these multi-state operators.
You're good at what you do. They will be decreasing consistently, apparently, after the first year or so of legalization in a state or area, whether it's medical or adult use. The supply constraints or local monopolistic practices raise all the prices, but then it's followed by increased efficiency, and then the prices go back down. So that's been pretty much across the board. It's kind of happened that way where they go, oh, we're doing it. Oh, all right, let's get everybody even back out. Which I thought was really interesting, but I'm also excited to hear. And lastly, and maybe the dumbest of all the questions, but not really, because it's actually pretty influential, who is among the most popular cannabis influencers across social media? Is it A, Miley Cyrus, B, Jaleel White or Steve Urkel, or C, Steve D'Angelo?
Steve D'Angelo.
Yeah, the father of the cannabis industry, who is the co-founder and chairman of Emeritus of Harborside, which is a prominent dispensary chain out of Oakland, California. Yeah. What do you know about Steve? Do you follow him?
I met Steve in Las Vegas a couple of years ago at NJ BizCon. He's like, I don't want to denigrate him from an age perspective, but he's kind of considered the grandfather of the industry or the father of the industry. People know him. He's done a lot. And it's not just, it's not just in the industry side, but for incarcerated individuals, and he's very active, but has a major following across social media for, not surprisingly.
Yeah, I was really excited to see that it wasn't like, a Kardashian type influencer. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't just the cliche musician or what, just because I feel like it adds to so many different stereotypes about things. But this is actually someone who's done so much work to benefit the field, to move things forward, to change things, and for him to be by far the top of all the different people. Not to discredit musicians or other people who put it out there in a really positive way or encourage medical use or letting the incarcerated individuals out. None of that is like discrediting, but I was excited to see that someone like from the cannabis space and been in the cannabis space for so long was like the very top by far on that list. Yeah. So, John, it's so amazing to talk to you. I feel like we got so many cool nuggets of information. And I think what's really I want to just kind of wrap up with is that people do think of lawyers as boring or, scary or a lot of different things, rich and wealthy and off on their own little private island somewhere. And I think what's really cool is you're a great example of someone who, yes, you're a lawyer and you work with a firm, but you do things to benefit the overall well-being of people. I consider you almost like a wellness practicing lawyer because you focus within that sort of space. And then there just shows that there's so many different things you can do with a law degree. Like, you don't have to just go and, defend crappy people. I mean, or, all the different things that we've seen in television and movies. And if you want to speak on that at all before we wrap up, I'd just love to give you a moment.
No, I went to law school for not the best, kind of thought out reason, but I found what I'm passionate about, and it makes it fun, and it's stressful. I mean, you and I have talked about this before. It's work, right? They don't call it work for nothing, but it is interesting personalities, interesting characters, interesting issues. But it really is kind of that next level of, okay, I've learned the issues, the laws. How do I apply that in a situation that's never really been resolved before and still isn't resolved? So there are a lot of different career paths. I would encourage you, if you're thinking about going to law school, think about why you're going. It's not that you can't change your mind, but it's an expensive investment. If I could go back and do it all over again, maybe I would have gone to law school, maybe not. But look, I'm making the best of it, and I am having a good time, and to me that's important.
Absolutely. That's what you hope that your career ends up getting to, right? Is that kind of idea. So thank you so much for being here. If anyone wants to reach out or find you, is there a good way to be able to
yeah,
do
so
that?
I'm not a huge fan of Twitter, but I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is regulatory, ATTY for attorney. I'm really cool. I abbreviate things, mostly because of character limits. But if you just Google my name, Jonathan Havens, Saul Ewing, we're Saul.com. I'm glad to say we got that before Better Call Saul and before Breaking Bad, but it's Saul.com. But I would love to hear from you if you have questions, if you disagreed with something I said, if you want to correct me. I'm always learning, like many of you are, so I would love to hear from you.
Okay, and I know that you're active somewhat on LinkedIn as well. If people want to try to connect.
The cool platform, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitch yet or TikTok, but if you're interested in things like lawyer cannabis dancing, maybe we'll get into that one day.
Oh, awesome. It was so fantastic having you on our 420 show. Thank you so much for enlightening us with all of your expertise, and I really appreciate you. I hope you have a safe and wonderful
Thank you.
weekend.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to MarketPlay this week. I'm your host, Meryl Hathaway. We're brought to you by Two Trees PPC out of Sacramento, California. Always fighting for the small business. If you liked our podcast, don't forget to subscribe, leave us a review, and share it with your colleagues. Have a safe week out there, and we'll see you next time.